They thought an eviction notice was just paper-typed words. Tape, authority no one questioned. But on one quiet street, a veteran refused to move. When the clipboard arrived with threats, he made a single phone call and within minutes, the block filled with patrol cars. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as law met memory, and silence proved stronger than signatures. What could one man carry in his pocket that forced even the hardest officials to pause? This isn't just about a home, it's about the moment. An entire street learned that rules can bend when respect is remembered. Would you have stood with him? The hallway was already awake before most of the tenants stirred. Its air smelled faintly of boiled coffee, a trace left by the night guard who brewed it too strong, and dust that never really left no matter how often a mop passed through. The walls bore the kind of beige paint that could never be called new, only repainted enough times to forget its first layer. Pipes hummed softly behind them, pushing warmth through the spine of the building. On one door, near the center of the hall, a notice clung like an unwanted guest. The paper had been taped in the night, while footsteps echoed and keys jangled. When the building was quieter and less likely to question, one corner had already curled, the glue in the tape yellowed and cracking. The typed words stood bold and certain, their authority printed in ink thick enough to demand belief. But the authority was borrowed, not crowned by any seal. The door itself bore the weight of years. Its paint had faded unevenly, touched more often by hands in uniform than by brushes. A small brass number plate, tarnished green at the edges, identified the unit as though numbers could tell a story. Around the knob, the wood showed faint circles from keys turned countless times. Each rotation, a measure of routine and survival. The notice stood out against all of this, a sheet too white, too thin, too loud for the quiet dignity of the door it claimed to govern. The hallway sighed as the heating system adjusted. Fluorescence along the ceiling flickered once, then steadied. The hum of their ballast filled the silence with a note that felt mechanical but dependable. Far down the hall, a stairwell door opened briefly and closed with a metallic thud. The sound traveled the corridor like an announcement, but died before reaching the taped paper. The building pretended it was an ordinary morning. Behind the door, the veteran stirred. He had risen early, as always, body trained long ago, to wake before daylight demanded it. His kettle clicked on the counter, steam rising into a kitchen that carried the same smell as the hallway, but tempered with polish and order. Medals sat in a shadow box on the far wall, their ribbons faded, but their metal still catching light. A folded flag rested on a shelf above them, corners sharp, graces permanent. The notice outside waited for his hand, but inside the apartment he straightened the table first, a habit learned when order was the only barrier between chaos and silence. The paper on the door was not his first notice, though the language sharpened each time. This one cited deadlines and consequences with the confidence of a voice that assumed no one would challenge it. The sentences marched like commands, each line ending with a threat disguised as procedure. Yet the paper carried no court stamp, no signature of a judge, no authority beyond the clipboard that had left it in the night. In the hallway, a draft lifted the edges of the paper, making it flutter faintly, as though restless to be read. The tape held, though it strained against the pull of air. A neighbor's door opened, hinges creaking, and a man in a work shirt stepped out with a lunch pail. His eyes caught the notice and paused. He did not stop walking, but his pace slowed for 2 steps before returning to its rhythm. The notice was not his, but it carried enough weight to shift his morning. Silence returned quickly. The building swallowed small sounds of cough through thin walls. A faucet turning, a radio playing too low to name the song. The notice remained unmoved, standing as both object and declaration. Its presence altered the hallway the way a shadow changes a room. When the veteran finally opened his door, the hinge moved without complaint, well-oiled and quiet. His eyes found the paper immediately, not surprised, only steady. He read the first line once, lips moving as though measuring the weight of each word. The tape strained again in the draft, but it held. He reached out, not to tear it down yet, but to press the corner flat against the wood, as though acknowledging its attempt to matter. The building exhaled with him. Pipes groaned, fluorescence hummed. The faint smell of boiled coffee still lingered. The day outside remained ordinary for those who wanted to believe it was. But on that door, taped and curling, the notice had already changed the rhythm. It was more than paper, it was the beginning of a confrontation written in silence, waiting to be answered. Inside the apartment, morning did not arrive in a rush. It spread in increments, like light creeping under a door, uncertain whether to enter. The kettle on the counter clicked once more, before falling silent, its red bulb extinguishing, as if the task of boiling had been complete enough. Steam trailed upward, gathering on the cabinet above. then dispersing into the small kitchen that carried the faint smell of polish and old wood. The veteran moved without hurry, though every motion was deliberate. He had long ago trained his body to a rhythm that did not need alarms or bugles. He rose when the air shifted, when pipes hummed through the walls, when the silence between hours grew thinner. His wristwatch sat on the counter face down, its metal band scuffed from years of wear. He did not need to see its hands to know the time. On the table near the window sat a small arrangement that never changed. A folded flag, edges sharp enough to seem cut by blade, and a shadow box of medals whose colors had dulled under glass but had never lost their weight. Next to them, a photograph in black and white, edges taped after years of handling, faces staring into a horizon that belonged to another time. The veteran straightened the frame with his palm, not out of vanity, but because order steadied him when paper outside tried to dislodge it. The room itself carried the mark of his habits. The bed was made to a standard most would not attempt. Corners tucked, sheets stretched smooth enough to reflect the faint shine of light. The boots by the door were lined heel to wall, their polish worn down by streets rather than parade squares, but aligned as if awaiting inspection. Even the mail on the counter was stacked, envelopes squared, though he had yet to open most of them. Routine was not decoration here. It was structure, built to withstand days that tried to break it. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second marking itself against the quiet. Its face was plain. Government issued once, numbers bold enough to be read at a distance. The veteran checked it, without lifting his eyes, already knowing what it would say. The hour mattered less than the precision of acknowledging it. He poured hot water into a chipped mug, steam rising once more, the sound of liquid filling ceramic the only noise against the silence. Outside, the hallway carried on with its low hum fluorescence. Footsteps, pipes. Through the window, the street below still slept. No cars had yet lined the curb. No shopkeepers had lifted their shutters. The world beyond seemed in agreement with the building. Pretend it was just another morning. Yet the paper taped to his door, curled at the corner, said otherwise. He sat at the table and spread before him the contents of a folder he kept in the bottom drawer. A copy of his discharge papers, the DD-214, creased where it had been folded and unfolded too many times. An identification card, its lamination cracking at the edges. And beneath them, a thin letter typed years ago, granting recognition of service. Its signature neat, its seal embossed faintly enough to feel with fingertips. He laid them out in a row, side by side, as though preparing evidence for a hearing that might arrive any moment. The veteran sipped from his mug, the taste bitter but grounding. His eyes moved once toward the door, as though he could see the notice through wood and paint. He did not need to. He knew the typeface by memory now, the clauses recycled, the tone of finality meant to persuade. He had seen it before, and he knew it would return again. Altered but never honest. The apartment remained steady in its silence. Each object seemed to play its role. In the hour, the flag, the medals, the photograph, the papers on the table, even the boots by the wall. They stood as witnesses more than possessions, holding the line while the world outside prepared to test it. The hour did not announce itself loudly. It settled in ink on paper, in steam from a kettle, in the quiet resolve of a man who had learned long ago that some mornings begin with orders, others with notices, but all demand composure. When he finished his drink, he placed the mug down exactly where it had sat the morning before. He gathered the papers into their folder, aligned the edges, and returned it to the drawer. Then he adjusted the chair back under the table, checked the crease of the flag once more, and breathed out slowly. The apartment had learned the hour. The day, whatever weight it carried, would be met in silence first. Action second. The elevator rattled as it climbed, carrying with it the sound of metal cables straining in a shaft too narrow for comfort. The property manager stood inside, a clipboard balanced against his chest, a ring of keys hooked through his thumb. He studied his reflection in the elevator's dull mirror, though the glass offered little clarity. Fluorescent light washed his face flat, leaving no shadows to soften the creases that deepened when he rehearsed words silently to himself. The clipboard was heavier than its weight suggested, paper clipped tight, duplicate copies stacked in order. A carbon sheet sandwiched between them so nothing written could be denied later. A pen dangled on a short cord, the kind purchased in bulk, the kind no one bothers to steal. He tapped it against the board once, then twice, as though confirming that authority resided not in him but in the objects he carried. The ring of keys clinked whenever the elevator jolted. Some were brass, worn to smoothness by years of use. Others were new, their edges still sharp enough to cut a pocket. He knew which one fit the veteran's door, had checked it twice before leaving his office. It hung heavier than the others, though identical in size. He touched it once, then let it drop, the sound of its return swallowed by the hum of the car. When the elevator doors parted, the hallway beyond looked half awake. Fluorescents buzzed overhead, some still flickering, as if reluctant to commit. The air smelled faintly of floor wax, layered over the deeper odor of dust and boiled coffee that clung to the building's bones. His shoes clicked against tile as he stepped forward, the sound precise, echoing just enough to draw attention, even where no one looked. The clipboard shifted in his grip. He tightened his hand, the paper edges biting faintly into his palm. On the top page, the heading declared notice of termination in bold type, letters squared and certain. Below, paragraphs cited statutes, subsections, deadlines. Each line pressed its authority without apology. The language borrowed from templates drafted by attorneys who had never walked these halls. He had read it twice already. The words so rehearsed, they no longer felt like sentences, but commands meant to be obeyed. He moved down the corridor. Past doors closed against him. Behind one, a television murmured low. Behind another, pipes groaned where someone had turned a tap. The building breathed in its quiet way, each sound carrying its own small testimony. Still, his steps sounded louder than all of it. Keys clinked again, the ring like a punctuation mark on each stride. Halfway down, he slowed. The veteran's door stood ahead, brass number plate dulled by years. Paint worn around the knob, where hands had turned it again and again. The notice taped there last night still clung, corner curled, tape strained, but holding. He did not remove it. He only looked long enough to confirm it remained visible, legible, present. Procedure required visibility more than fairness. He shifted the clipboard once more and cleared his throat. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, meant less for the man inside than for the record he imagined surrounding him. Final notice, he said, the words catching in the air like chalk on a blackboard. He tapped the paper on the door with the back of the clipboard. A knock that was not quite a knock. Silence answered him, the kind of silence that carries weight, not absence. He shifted again, uncomfortable, but pressed forward. Keys jingled, his thumb sliding over the brass one marked for this door. He let it rest in his palm, cool and heavy, before returning it to the ring. Procedure would not permit him to use it yet, but holding it reminded him of the authority he carried, or thought he did. The hallway hummed with fluorescent light, steady now, no flicker left. He checked his watch, noted the time, and wrote it in the margin of the page. The pen pressed deep enough to leave an impression on the sheet beneath. Time of arrival, 8:15. His initials followed, cramped but legible. The clipboard now carried proof of presence. The first line in a record meant to survive the morning. Still, silence pressed back from the closed door. The building seemed to lean closer, as though listening. He tapped the clipboard once more against the paper already taped there, the sound hollow. Then he stepped back, ring of keys heavy at his side, clipboard lifted like a shield. The intent was written, the posture rehearsed, but the silence between him and the door remained unbroken, stronger than any statute he carried in ink. The hallway exhaled again, pipes adjusting, fluorescents buzzing, air shifting faintly. He stood waiting, clipboard firm in his hand, keys cool against his palm. A man rehearsing authority in a place that had not yet agreed to grant it. The veteran had been awake long before the clipboard's echo touched the hallway. He did not measure mornings in alarms or door knocks. He measured them in the geometry of his surroundings, the kind of order that never needed to be spoken but always needed to be maintained. On his floor, tiles stretched from bunk to window, from table to door, 12 across, 4 down. He had counted them so often the numbers lived in his breath. Each square bore faint scars from decades of footsteps. Corners dulled, edges darkened, but together they still aligned well enough to pass for uniform. He traced them with his eyes from the bed, not to pass time, but to steady it. Counting tiles replaced the march of steps he no longer needed to take. The room itself was small, but deliberate. A single bed pressed against the wall, sheets folded into corners so tight that even fatigue could not wrinkle them. A pillowcase centered exactly beneath the headboard. At the foot, boots placed held-to-wall, their laces tucked inside, polished to a shine that had dulled under years of use but still spoke of care. A chair rested against the table, pushed in just far enough that its legs aligned with the edge. Each object carried weight beyond its size. Each was a measure of discipline that kept the rest of the day from leaning. On the wall above the table hung a photograph, black and white, its edges taped where time had tried to fray it. The faces within stared beyond the frame, uniforms sharp, canvas backdrop plain. Below them, Names had been written in block letters by a steady hand, long gone. He had memorized the strokes long ago, but still he looked at them each morning, letting his eyes trace the grooves where ink had pressed into paper. The kettle on the counter clicked, reminding him that water had boiled and cooled again. He ignored it. Routine was not about consumption, but about preparation. He moved instead to the window and lifted the blind halfway. The street below remained quiet. No cars, no footsteps, only the pale light of a day undecided. He checked the horizon, the line of trees in the distance, the curve of the road that eventually carried buses and patrol cars. For now, it was empty. He turned back, eyes landing again on the tiles. He stepped once, twice, across them, each stride deliberate, counted not aloud, but within. 14 to the sink, 6 to the window, 3 back to the chair. The numbers aligned with memory. He had not forgotten. On the table, near the photograph, lay a leather wallet softened by years. Inside it, folded against cards and receipts, was a letter with its corner taped like the photograph above. He did not remove it now. He only touched the outline through leather, thumb pressing against the shape as if to confirm it still lived there. Proof waited quietly. It always had. Beyond the door, the clipboard had tapped again. He heard it clearly, though he did not move toward it. He let silence answer instead. Silence thick enough to remind anyone listening that the door belonged to him until a proper seal commanded otherwise. He straightened the photograph on the wall once more, adjusted the chair under the table, checked the boots against the wall. Each movement belonged to order, not reaction. The apartment exhaled with him, the radiator hissing briefly, then falling still. Light shifted through the blinds, cutting the room into bars of gray and white. Dust floated where it caught, drifting slowly toward the tiles. He watched it settle on square 7, then brushed it away with his palm. The floor remained unbroken, lines intact. Outside, the building carried on fluorescence, humming, pipes clanging, a stairwell door slamming somewhere below. Inside, he kept counting. Tiles, steps, breaths. Each number placed him exactly where he needed to be. Not behind the notice, not beneath the clipboard, not within the reach of keys. Here, inside 4 walls where order still obeyed him, where memory was not erased by ink. He breathed again, slow, steady, 12 tiles across, 4 down. The world outside could measure in notices and deadlines. He would measure in squares that aligned, in corners that held, in silence stronger than any tap on a door. The paper had been designed to look final. Its font was bold, centered lines spaced with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was half of authority. Words like termination and vacate carried themselves as if backed by iron gates and gavel strikes. Paragraphs cited codes, subsections, and penalties with a rhythm practiced enough to feel unquestionable. To most, it was lace-stitched in ink, delicate in structure but meant to bind, fine enough to cover absence with the illusion of substance. The veteran studied it from inside the doorway without tearing it down. The notice fluttered faintly when air from the stairwell draft pressed against it, tape stretching but refusing to yield. He had seen such pages before, in other halls, from other managers, each iteration revised but never corrected. The pattern was familiar: borrowed language, confident formatting, an absence of the one mark that would make it law. No court seal, no judge's signature, no stamp pressed so deep it left an indentation on the back. Only typewritten certainty printed in black ink. He did not argue with the paper. He never had. Instead, he returned to the table inside his apartment, where years were measured not in statutes but in records he carried like rations. A folder lay flat before him, its corners rounded from handling, its spine soft from use. He opened it with both hands, palms steady, and spread its contents the way one would lay out equipment before a march. First, the discharge papers, DD 214, creased but legible. Every line of service recorded in the block-letter confidence of military bureaucracy. Unit assignments, awards, honorable discharge marked without ambiguity. He traced one line with his finger, not because he needed to read it again, but because he needed to feel the indentation where pen met paper decades earlier. Next, a letter folded into thirds, its ink faint now, but still readable, typed on government letterhead. It bore the embossed seal of an agency that rarely granted anything beyond numbers and forms. At the bottom, a signature real, not copied by an officer who had once shaken his hand and thanked him for service. The page had grown yellow at the edges, its corners soft, but the embossed seal still rose firm under his fingertips. That texture mattered more than any words typed above it. Finally, the photograph, smaller than the papers, but heavier in its own way. Black and white, edges taped where years had tried to undo them. The faces in the image were arranged in rows, uniforms crisp, eyes fixed on a horizon not captured in the frame. On the reverse, names written in blocked letters, dates pressed deep by a pen, carried long ago in a breast pocket. Among them was his own, inked by someone else's hand. Proof that memory lived not only in minds but in paper. He laid them side by side. The notice outside the door still taped, pretending to matter. Here, on the table, were documents older, thicker, steadier. They carried stamps, signatures, seals embossed into paper grain. They bore the kind of weight that does not need bold fonts to command. The apartment seemed to acknowledge the contrast. The folded flag on the shelf caught faint light from the window, its creases permanent, its edges sharper than any paragraph written by a property manager. The metals in their shadow box glinted, muted but present, as if agreeing with the papers spread below. Even the boots by the door stood aligned hilt, silent witnesses to the difference between lace and steel. He gathered the folder again, stacking each page carefully, aligning corners before sliding them back into place. The photograph he held a moment longer, brushing his thumb against the taped edge, before tucking it back into the wallet, where it always lived. The wallet returned to his pocket, its weight familiar, its outline pressing against his thigh with quiet assurance. The notice outside remained taped, its corner curling further, as if impatient for recognition. But the veteran had already measured it against the weight of years. Lace paper tried to bind him, but paper stamped, sealed, and carried across decades spoke louder. He closed the drawer, straightened the chair, and let silence answer where words were unnecessary. The building shifted again, the hum of pipes, the flicker of fluorescent bulbs, a cough muffled through thin walls. The notice fluttered once more, but inside the apartment, the weight of years held steady above the junction where two hallways met. A small black dome clung to the ceiling, like an afterthought. Dust ringed its base, proof that cleaners had wiped around it, without touching the lens itself. Behind the smoked plastic, a red diode pulsed in intervals too slow to alarm anyone, but steady enough to remind those who noticed. The camera was awake. The hallway gave little back in return. Its paint was beige, uniform but chipped near the baseboards. Its tiles scuffed where decades of tenants had dragged boxes or groceries. Fluorescent strips buzzed with the same persistence they had yesterday and the day before. To anyone passing through, the camera was just another fixture. A piece of the architecture, as unremarkable as the fire extinguisher mounted mid. Yet its presence altered behavior. Neighbors paused before arguing. Visitors shifted their posture, and the clipboard man, when he tapped on the veteran's door, tilted his body slightly so the lens could not miss his effort. The camera did not reward him. It did not record intent or pride. It only measured movement, stored pixels, and marked each second with the indifference of circuitry. When the clipboard tapped once, the red light pulsed twice. When silence answered from behind the door, the diode continued its rhythm. Unmoved by tension, the veteran knew it was there. He had counted its blinks once. Late at night, when the hall was quiet, and the hum of fluorescence seemed louder than his own breath. 60 blinks equaled a minute, and each blink had no memory of the one before. He understood what it captured. Rectangles of doors, shifts of shadows, occasional faces glancing up, but never down. He also understood what it missed. The weight in a man's voice when he said final notice. The resolve in silence when no answer came. Machines recorded form, not meaning. Inside the apartment, he stood near the window, watching light gather along the street outside. Curtains twitched across from him. Someone had noticed the clipboard at his door. He did not move toward the peephole. He did not need to. The lens above the hallway would already be swallowing the scene, saving it to a server rack humming in some basement where tapes or drives now were replaced on schedule. Weeks from now, the footage would overwrite itself. To the system, this morning was disposable. The clipboard man shifted uneasily. Sensing the camera though, he did not look at it directly. He raised the notice again, tapped it louder this time, and made a note on his form. The lens captured the movement of his pen, the angle of his shoulders, the tilt of his head. It stored these gestures without hierarchy, the same way it stored a janitor pushing a mop or a child skipping down the corridor. The system did not weigh one frame more than another. For the veteran, this was both comfort and reminder. Comfort, because the camera's indifference meant it could not testify against silence. Reminder, because when the time came, it would also fail to testify for him. Proof carried in pixels was fragile. Proof carried in paper and memory was heavier. That was why the folder rested ready in his drawer. Why the photograph traveled always in his pocket. The hallway breathed in cycles. Fluorescent hum, radiator hiss, the faint creak of wood where doors met frames. The camera blinked through it all, steady, unfeeling, its red light pulsing like a heartbeat that belonged to no one. The clipboard man eventually turned, keys jangling, shoes tapping against tile. The lens followed him without intention, storing his retreat the same way it had stored his arrival. Behind the veteran's door, silence remained intact. He pressed his palm once against the folder, then against the wallet in his pocket, before resuming his seat at the table. The camera blinked above, indifferent to objects heavier than paper or memory. It would remember shapes and times, but not the difference between authority rehearsed and authority earned. The block still slept outside. Inside, the red light blinked on, off, on again. Unaware of the notice, the silence, or the weight of years waiting to be measured properly. The knock came not as violence, but as procedure. Knuckles against wood, measured, rehearsed, calculated to sound official. The hallway echoed it softly, carrying the sound to the far corners where no one would open their doors but all would listen. The property manager paused afterward, clipboard raised like a badge, pen ready to mark the time. Inside, the veteran did not move. His chair remained pulled in, his papers aligned, his boots against the wall. He heard the sound, sharp against the otherwise quiet corridor. But he had trained himself long ago that not every knock deserved an immediate answer. Some were tests of patience, others were meant to gauge reaction. Silence, he had learned, was often the stronger posture. The first knock was followed by a second, louder, less patient, the rhythm breaking slightly, as though the knuckles themselves doubted their authority. The clipboard shifted, the pen scribbled, a note logged, attempted contact. The manager's shoes scuffed against tile as he stepped back, creating space between himself and the door, the way one does when waiting for compliance. The veteran looked toward the wood, then away again. The notice fluttered faintly at the draft where the hole met the stairwell. It wanted recognition, demanded acknowledgement. He gave it none. Instead, he returned his attention to the photograph taped at its corners. Faces staring past the years, into a horizon they could not see, but believed was there. He whispered the first name under his breath, then the second, steadying himself as if reading a roll call. The hallway camera blinked its red eye overhead, recording the small theater but understanding none of it. It captured the manager's shift of weight, the pen pressed into carbon paper, the way his lips moved in muttered irritation. It caught the veteran's door unmoving. The brass number dulled, the paper still curled at its corner. What it missed was the meaning of silence that filled the space between knock and reply. Neighbors heard it too. Behind one door, a radio turned lower. Behind another, footsteps paused mid-stride. No one opened, but ears leaned closer. Hearts measured their own pace against the authority claimed in the hallway. Silence grew heavier with each second, more deliberate. Less like absence, and more like defiance. The manager knocked again, but the rhythm faltered. This time it was a duller sound, less confident, less sharp. His clipboard hand trembled faintly as he tried to keep writing while waiting for a response. He pressed his lips tight, drew a breath, and announced the notice aloud in a voice that carried down the corridor, but did not penetrate the door. The words sounded practiced, each syllable pulled from a manual rather than a conviction. Failure to vacate will result in removal by force, he said, but the tone cracked at the edges. Inside, the veteran rose. He walked the 12 tiles to the window, looked down at the empty street, then returned. His steps were quiet, his breath steady. He stood by the door, close enough to hear the scrape of pen against clipboard, the shuffle of shoes, the shallow breaths of a man who wanted obedience without earning it. He placed his palm flat against the wood, not to push, not to open, but simply to remind himself of the barrier still intact. The silence stretched further, dense enough to weigh on the clipboard man's shoulders. He shifted again, cleared his throat, looked once toward the camera overhead as though hoping for its support. The red light blinked back, impartial, indifferent. The hallway hummed with fluorescent light, pipes groaning faintly behind the walls. At last, the pen scribbled another note. No response. Shoes retreated 3 steps. Keys clinked. The manager muttered something low, words swallowed by the corridor. Then he turned, his shadow shrinking as he moved back toward the elevator. The door remained closed. The veteran lowered his hand, returned to his chair, and straightened the folder once more. Silence had answered, and silence had been enough. The building exhaled with him, pipes cooling, lights humming steady. The paper outside still fluttering faintly, as though impatient to be torn. But for now, the answer had been given not in voice, not in action, but in refusal to yield a single word. The notice had been printed on crisp white stock, heavier than office paper but lighter than anything a courtroom would ever issue. Its bold heading notice of termination announced itself with the kind of confidence that leaned on typography for strength. Subsections lined the margins, numbers and letters strung together like coordinates, as though the very complexity of the citations might distract from their emptiness. At the bottom, a name was typed, neat but without distinction, followed by a signature that seemed too hurried, too slanted, too slow. It leaned forward on the page like a man running downhill, unable to stop. The veteran had seen papers that carried real weight, orders stamped by battalion clerks, folded and refolded until the creases cut into the fibers like scars. Certificates embossed with seals so deep that even a blind hand could read their authority. Warrants stamped with ink so heavy the back of the page bore its ghost. Those papers carried command because they bore the marks of systems larger than men. This one bore only the ambition of a clipboard. The hallway remained quiet, the air thick with the residue of unanswered knocks. The notice clung to the door, as though proximity to wood could lend it power. Its tape strained at the edges, corners curling, but the words stayed visible enough to be read from a few steps away. The property manager had left it there deliberately, believing its placement transformed it into an order. He had written the time on his clipboard, added his initials, and walked away with the posture of someone who thought the building itself now worked for him. Inside, the veteran opened the drawer once more. The folder lay waiting, its contents heavier than the paper outside could imagine. He placed the DD-214 on the table, letting its folds breathe again. The ink had faded, but the block letters remained steady, unemotional, precise. He set beside it the embossed letter with its government seal, its edges yellowed but its authority permanent. Then the photograph, taped at its corners, names written in block letters across the back. He laid them out in order, side by side, proof layered against performance. He whispered a phrase under his breath, one drilled into him years ago, authority recognized, not claimed. It had been said by a sergeant with a voice like gravel, a man who taught that a command shouted without rank was noise, but a command spoken with earned authority carried the weight of law. The paper outside shouted, the papers inside spoke. The camera in the hallway blinked its red diode, indifferent to the difference. It stored the rectangle of the notice against the wood, the time of day, the flicker of fluorescent light overhead, but it did not measure the lack of a seal, the weakness of the signature, the gap between statute and bluff. Machines could store images, but not judgment. Neighbors noticed. A woman returning from the stairwell slowed her pace, her grocery bag rustling as she passed. Her eyes caught the notice, lingered for a second, then shifted away. She did not stop, but she would remember the paper when she set her bags down on her own counter. In another unit, someone peered through the peephole, saw only the white square on the veteran's door, and retreated again. The hallway absorbed their quiet, storing it like layers of dust. The veteran closed the folder carefully, sliding each page back into place, corners aligned. He returned it to the drawer, but left his wallet on the table. The outline of the photograph pressed against the leather, its weight familiar. He placed his hand over it, steady, as though confirming that proof lived, where performance could not touch it. The notice fluttered again as a draft moved through the corridor. It sounded almost like a flag in miniature, but no one saluted it. Its language was stern, its format official, but it lacked the one thing that transformed paper into law: recognition. Without the stamp, without the seal, without the quartz mark pressed deep enough to scar, it was only paper pretending. The apartment stayed still. Pipes groaned behind the walls, lights hummed, and dust settled on tiles counted too often to be ignored. The veteran sipped from his mug, its contents lukewarm but grounding, and let silence weigh heavier than the notice. Paper that thinks it's a warrant remains fragile until proven otherwise. He had learned long ago. Silence could outlast bluff, and weight would always outlast lace. The telephone sat on the counter, its plastic shell scratched but functional, its cord curled into loops that had long ago lost their spring. The veteran had kept it out of habit, not out of dependence. He knew the sequence without needing to look. 3 digits that changed the weight of a moment. Numbers that did not wait for persuasion. When the last knock faded into silence and footsteps retreated toward the elevator, he sat for a while at the table, steadying himself in routine. He counted the tiles once more, traced the edge of the folder with his finger, and checked the angle of the photograph on the wall. Only then did he lift the receiver, as calm as if he were dialing a friend to confirm a meeting. The dial tone hummed low, neutral, ready. He pressed the digits, one by one. The sound of each button, soft but decisive. 911. The tone paused, then shifted into the rhythm of a connection searching. He did not lean forward, did not raise his voice when the operator answered. His words carried no tremor, no urgency. They were measured, as though he were reading coordinates from a map. Illegal lockout in progress, he said. Each syllable landed evenly, like boots on gravel. Cross Street 5th and Jackson, apartment 24. He recited the details with precision. Address, floor, unit number. No extra words, no embellishment. Just the facts arranged cleanly enough to leave no gaps. The dispatcher asked him to repeat the claim. He did, exactly as before, the cadence unchanged. Attempted eviction without court order. Property manager present. Paper on my door. The operator began to type. The sound of keystrokes muffled through the line but unmistakable. His words became data, entered into a system that turned speech into codes, and codes into responses. The veteran's voice did not waver. It carried the steadiness of someone who had called in coordinates before, where mistakes meant lives instead of paperwork. He gave his name, slow and clear, then paused when asked for a description. Male, 72, resident, that was all. No more, no less. He left silence to fill what the dispatcher might have expected. No mention of medals, of service, of the years stored in his folder, just the present fact of who he was and where he stood. The operator confirmed units would be dispatched. Please remain inside your apartment until officers arrive, she instructed. He answered with a single word, copy. Then he lowered the receiver, placed it gently back into its cradle, and sat once more at the table. The kettle clicked in the corner, its cooling element contracting with small metallic sounds. Outside, the hallway remained unchanged. The notice still fluttered. The camera still blinked. The fluorescence still hummed. But the air felt different. Invisible lines had been drawn now. Coordinates passed through wires, transmitted to screens glowing in a dispatch center across town. Somewhere, officers were noting the call. Radios were repeating the words possible, unlawful eviction, and engines were turning over. The veteran leaned back in his chair and rested one hand on the wallet in his pocket. Inside, the photograph pressed against the leather like a heartbeat. He had not raised his voice, had not opened his door, had not shouted down the hallway. Yet the temperature of the building had shifted. A silent apartment, a steady voice, and 3 digits pressed in sequence had been enough. He sipped what remained of his coffee, now lukewarm but drinkable. He did not rush. Sirens would come soon enough, carrying with them questions and forms, body cameras and pens. He had done his part. The rest belonged to the weight of procedure. A different kind of march that began the moment he named his street. The apartment exhaled with him. Pipes cooled, lights buzzed. The chair creaked faintly under his weight. Outside the window, the horizon brightened, though the street remained empty. It would not be empty for long. The call had changed the temperature. Silence had given way to motion, and the block would soon feel it. In a low-lit room across town, screens glowed against the dark. Dispatchers sat in rows, headsets pressed close, keyboards tapping like steady rain. Each screen divided itself into squares of text, codes, and maps. A language meant less for reading than for responding. On one, a new line appeared, the product of a voice recorded minutes earlier. Disturbance. Possible unlawful eviction. Cross Street, 5th and Jackson, apartment 24. Caller, male, 72. The cursor blinked once. Then another window opened. The dispatcher copied the words into a CAD entry, a system that never slept. Each field had a name, time received, incident type, unit assigned, priority level. Fingers typed with precision, abbreviations replacing full sentences. The call shed its human tone and took the shape of numbers, codes, and symbols. The veteran's voice had been calm. That detail did not survive the transition. What remained were coordinates and categories. Illegal lockout. The system weighed those words, compared them against priority tables, and stamped the line with urgency. Officers were already in the area, 1 block east, their cruiser idling outside a convenience store. The dispatcher tapped their unit number into the box, hit enter, and the screen lit blue. On the patrol car's dashboard, the mobile terminal chirped. A new alert slid across the display, its text crisp against the glass. Unlawful eviction, -5th, and Jackson, apt 24. Time, 8:23. The officer in the driver's seat glanced at it, his hand moving automatically to acknowledge receipt. His partner leaned closer, reading aloud, though the words were already stored in both memory and machine. Illegal lockout, apartment 24, copy. The radio crackled the exchange into the airwaves, repeating the information so every listening unit could hear. A supervisor keyed his mic and asked for clarification. The dispatcher's voice, measured and neutral, filled the channel. Caller states property manager, attempting eviction without court order. Paper posted. No response inside. Caller remains in unit. Advise. The supervisor gave the order. Units 12 and 14 respond. Supervisor en route. Marker has active disturbance. Document thoroughly. The last phrase carried weight. Document thoroughly meant this one could not be buried under routine. The dispatcher logged each update. Unit 12 acknowledged, followed seconds later by Unit 14. Estimated arrival time, 3 minutes. The system updated the map. Tiny car icons shifting toward the intersection. Their progress measured in blocks. Their positions recalculated every few seconds. The screen turning the city into coordinates and motion. The street itself had not yet changed. Outside the veteran's window, the pavement remained empty, the curb lined only with shadows. The building stood quiet, fluorescence buzzing, the notice still fluttering faintly on his door. But in the dispatch center, lines of text expanded, time-stamped and marked, transforming silence into procedure. Each keystroke wrote the block closer to interruption. The veteran, seated at his table, could not see the screens or hear the radio, yet he knew the rhythm by memory. Calls became entries. Entries became assignments. Assignments became presents. He had once watched maps fill with symbols during operations overseas. The city worked no differently, only with softer codes and civilian tones. Back at dispatch, the operator typed one more line. Supervisor notified. Additional units may be requested. She hit enter. The words stamped themselves into the log. Permanent, time-marked, as unyielding as ink on paper. The cursor blinked again, waiting for the next detail. Outside, the street had begun to change, even if eyes could not yet see it. Engines turned. Tires shifted from rest to motion. Light bars flickered once in test, before silence reclaimed them. 3 minutes became 2, then 1. The notice on the veteran's door fluttered again, in the draft, but this time its authority felt thinner, outpaced by the weight of procedure rolling closer in measured inches. Dispatch watched, logged, and measured. The street, though quiet, had already been written. At first, it was only a murmur being cut by distance, sound bent by corners. Then the pitch rose, stretched and carried itself down the grid of streets, until it pressed against the windows like a hand insisting to be felt. The sirens did not scream. They declared. Their tone lengthened the morning, pulling every glance from every window curtain. The veteran sat at his table, hands folded loosely, his mug beside him half drained. He did not flinch at the noise. He had known the cadence of sirens in other lands, where they preceded ambulances, convoys, or the movement of units toward a checkpoint. Here, they were slower, steadier, less desperate, but no less certain. Each rise and fall of pitch moved closer, carving the block into segments of time, first distant, then near, then present. On the street outside, shadows shifted before the cars themselves appeared. Lights refracted off glass, red and blue cutting across window panes, slicing into the dust of morning. Tires whispered against painted curbs, brakes released in sighs, then held. The block that had woken to the smell of coffee and dust now found itself held in color and sound. The first cruiser rolled to a stop near the entrance of the building. Its engine ticked as it idled, door opening with a solid thud. A second followed, then a third, each finding position with practiced precision. Radios crackled within, voices coded in brevity, confirming arrival, marking presence. The sirens lowered, then cut off completely, leaving only the clicking of cooling engines and the faint hum of overhead light bars. The cadence shifted again, now measured in door slams and boots on pavement. Officers emerged, their posture collected, their steps unhurried but coordinated. They scanned the block in silence first, then moved toward the entrance. Voices kept low, hands resting on belts, more out of habit than need. Their radios chirped again. Units 12 and 14, on-scene dispatch logged the time. 8:27. The street itself seemed to take note. Upstairs, the notice still clung to the veteran's door. One corner more curled than before. The tape strained but did not break. The hallway camera blinked its red diode, catching only the faint reflection of blue lights against polished tile. The air felt denser now, filled with expectation. Behind doors, neighbors leaned closer to peepholes, their silence louder than speech. The property manager had not expected the speed of the response. He lingered near the stairwell, clipboard hugged tight against his chest, pen caught between 2 fingers. The echo of boots climbing the steps reached him before the officers themselves appeared. His eyes darted to the notice, then back to the descending shadows. The clipboard felt suddenly heavier, its authority thinner. The veteran remained seated, still, his breath even. He had not moved toward the door, not yet. He understood the cadence of arrival. First the sirens, then the engines, then the boots, then the voices. Each carried weight, each marked a step closer to recognition. He let it unfold in order, counting it silently the way he had counted tiles on the floor. The sirens had chosen the rhythm. They had entered the block, altered its pulse, and left it waiting for the next measure. Silence followed them now, but it was no longer the silence of dust and coffee. It was the silence of a stage set, of an audience leaning in, of a notice trembling in its tape. When the officers reached the hallway, the cadence shifted again. Radios clipped to vests, murmuring status updates. Leather creaking as arms adjusted against equipment. Pens ready but capped. They passed under the camera, its red lights blinking without concern, and moved toward the door with the paper. The building had been pretending at ordinary hours all morning. The sirens had ended that pretense. Their rise and fall, their arrival and silence, had redrawn the block's rhythm. Now, every sound belonged to the cadence they had set, and nothing, not paper, not clipboard, not silence, could return the street to what it had been before. The block had never been so awake this early. The sirens had carried their message down every length of sidewalk, into every apartment window, and across every storefront glass. Curtains shifted like cautious eyelids, pulled just enough to allow slivers of faces to peer out. What had begun as an unnoticed notice on one door now unfolded into spectacle. Each pane of glass turned into a lens. Across the street, a boy in a striped t-shirt pressed his forehead to the cool window, his breath fogging the glass as he tried to make out the shapes of uniforms. His mother stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, her own face tense, though her eyes betrayed a curiosity she would not admit. Farther down, an elderly woman in a robe cracked her blinds with 2 fingers, watching silently, her silhouette framed in slats of light. In the building itself, doors stayed closed, but peepholes glowed faintly, with a reflection of hallway fluorescence. Tenants leaned forward, eyes unblinking, watching figures gather outside the veterans' unit. A cough muffled by a sleeve, a chair creaking faintly, small sounds, betrayed their hidden audience. The building had become an amphitheater, silence serving as applause, curiosity as chorus thought. The officers knew they were being watched. They always did. The weight of unseen eyes shifted the air, pressed against shoulders, sharpened posture. Still, their steps remained steady, their voices calm. Maintain position, one said, barely above a whisper, though it carried enough to reassure the corridor. They placed themselves deliberately, one by the stairwell, one near the elevator, a third directly in front of the door with the paper. Their formation spoke louder than any words. The property manager shifted near the corner, his clipboard held high, as though proximity to officers could transform carbon copies into law. His shoes squeaked once against the tile, and he immediately stilled, aware of how sound traveled differently now. Even his pen seemed hesitant to move. The confidence rehearsed in the elevator mirror that morning had thinned under the light of flashing bars. The notice fluttered again, restless in its tape. Corner curled almost fully now. It seemed fragile compared to the attention it drew. A single page bearing the weight of an entire audience. The camera above blinked. On, off, on again, capturing frames without understanding that every curtain had already turned itself into a witness dot inside. The veteran remained still. He had not risen from the table, had not moved to meet the officers, had not spoken through the door. He knew better than to let curiosity drive him to action. He understood that the weight of the moment lay not in being seen, but in remaining steady. Outside, the street shifted with each breath of the crowd hidden behind glass. Inside, silence held its ground. A patrol sergeant finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, deliberate. "We're here to confirm court authority," he said. Though his words were meant more for the clipboard than the man behind the door. His fingers traced the edge of the notice, his eyes scanning it once. Then again, curtains fluttered farther open at the sound, faces leaning closer, the audience straining for detail. One by one, more shadows appeared in windows. A teenager with earbuds paused his music, one bud dangling as he leaned forward. A shop clerk across the street propped his door open, pretending to sweep while keeping his gaze fixed on the building. Even a dog barked once, then fell quiet, as though joining the watch. The block was no longer ordinary. Its silence was filled with presence. Its privacy surrendered to curiosity. Every curtain had become a binocular lens, every face a witness. The officers knew it, the manager felt it, and the veteran understood it without moving. The notice on the door remained the same typed words on cheap paper, confident without foundation, but now it trembled under a heavier gaze. not because of its content, but because an entire street had chosen to lean in and remember it. The sergeant's arrival shifted the weight of the hallway. He moved without hurry, his boots steady against the tile, his presence calm rather than forceful. He carried no clipboard, no stack of carbon copies, no dangling pen tethered by cord. His authority was not rehearsed but lived, carried in the tone of his voice and the measured way he looked at the notice on the door. The property manager stiffened, pressing his own clipboard tighter to his chest. He had expected compliance by now, an open door, an older man yielding to paper. Instead, he found himself standing beside a presence that made his carbon forms feel smaller, thinner. The sergeant did not glance at him at first. His attention went directly to the taped sheet. One corner curled, words typed bold but hollow. "Good morning, sir," the sergeant said, his tone low but respectful, pitched toward the veteran behind the door. It was not the greeting of command, nor the false politeness of someone covering impatience. It was acknowledgement. The hallway seemed to still around the words. Neighbors frozen behind peepholes. Curtains pulled wider across the street. The clipboard man seized the pause. "This unit is in violation," he said. Words rushed, anxious to fill silence with his own certainty. He lifted the notice with 2 fingers, tapping it against the door as though to remind the sergeant of its existence. "Proper papers have been served. He's refused to comply." His voice rose slightly, carrying down the corridor, meant to reassure himself as much as anyone else. The sergeant finally looked at him. Eyes steady, face unreadable. He took the paper from the door, peeled it free with deliberate calm, and turned it once, twice, under the fluorescent light. His thumb pressed against the corner, testing for the stamp that wasn't there. His eyes scanned the bottom, where the signature leaned forward like a man hurrying down a slope. He frowned and, exaggerated, not performative, just a slight crease of thought. "This isn't a warrant," the sergeant said evenly. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. The words carried the finality of someone stating fact, not opinion. The property manager bristled, clutching his clipboard tighter, the pen trembling faintly in his hand. "It's the proper notice," he insisted, thrusting the clipboard forward. "Statutes cited, deadlines clear. He's had his time." His words came fast, clattering into the silence like loose change. The sergeant did not take the clipboard. Instead, he folded the notice once, neatly, as though tidying something that had been left in the wrong place. He turned back to the door, his voice softening. "Sir," he called, "I'd like to confirm your side. There's no court order here. I'll stand by while we sort this properly." Inside, the veteran sat still, listening. He did not move toward the door. Not yet. He had heard the phrase he had been waiting for. No court order. The silence that followed was no longer defensive. It was measured patience. The property manager shifted his weight again, his shoes squeaking faintly against the tile. He tried once more, his words thinner this time. "We followed procedure," he said, though his tone faltered under the weight of the sergeant's calm. Behind the door, the veteran rested his palm flat against the wood. Steady. The sergeant's voice carried recognition. The clipboards did not. Neighbors pressed closer behind curtains, their faces leaning into narrow openings, sensing the difference. The hallway camera blinked overhead, storing images without understanding that authority had just shifted hands. The sergeant tucked the folded paper into his vest pocket, as if to ensure it would not wander back onto the door. "We'll document thoroughly," he said, his tone final. "For now, this notice has no standing." His eyes returned to the clipboard, steady, waiting. The property manager swallowed, pen trembling, his certainty dissolving under a voice that did not shout, but carried more weight than pages ever could. The clipboard had rehearsed authority. The sergeant spoke with recognition. In the space between them, silence thickened once more, this time belonging to the veteran, who had not spoken a single word, yet had already been heard. The sergeant's vest carried a small black rectangle, clipped at the chest. Its lens was no larger than a button, its red light faint but steady. It watched without blinking, storing the scene in compressed frames and audio files that would later be catalogued by date and incident number. It would not recall the draft lifting the curled edge of the notice, or the weight behind the silence inside the door. It would only record what it saw and heard, stripped of meaning, archived in a system that mistook storage for memory. The camera captured the sergeant's hand, lifting the paper, the calm way he folded it once and slid it into his vest pocket. It recorded the property manager's pen, trembling against carbon paper. The clipboard hugged to his chest like a shield. It caught the words spoken. "This isn't a warrant. We'll document thoroughly." Each syllable flattened into audio that cared nothing for tone. The pause between words, the way silence filled the corridor, heavier than noise. went unnoticed by the machine. Behind the door, the veteran remained still, listening to voices filtered through wood. The camera could not see him, could not record the way his hand pressed flat against the door, steadying himself not against weakness, but against memory. It could not capture the faint rhythm of his breathing, even deliberate, as though pacing himself for a march that would never come. His silence was a statement. But to the camera, it was only absence. The property manager shifted again, his shoes squeaking faintly, clipboard pressed tighter. He muttered under his breath, statutes cited, deadlines clear. Words carried more for himself than anyone else. The body cam caught the sound, but not the tremor in his voice. Not the way his eyes flicked to the sergeant and then to the blinking diode above the hallway. Machines did not weigh nerves. They catalogued vibrations. The neighbors pressed closer behind peepholes. Curtains drawn wider across the street. Their eyes followed every movement, every word. They saw posture, heard tone, felt the imbalance between clipboard and calm. The camera did not. It only captured angles of uniforms. The door with its tarnished brass number. The paper's empty rectangle of adhesive left on wood. The sergeant spoke again, his voice low, deliberate. "We're here for a civil standby," he said. "Until a court order is produced. No one enters without consent." The words were simple, but the weight behind them steadied the corridor. The camera stored the sentence as audio, timestamped and filed. It did not understand that the phrase shifted the ground beneath the property manager's shoes, or that it carried a recognition the veteran had been waiting to hear. Inside. The veteran closed his eyes briefly, his hands still on the door. He whispered one word, copy, soft, steady, meant only for himself. The body cam did not hear it. The microphone caught only louder sounds. The shuffle of paper, the scratch of pen, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. The machine missed the quietest truths. The sergeant made another note in his log, writing slowly, block letters precise. No court order present. Lockout attempt advised. Documented. The camera watched the pen move, but did not know what the words meant beyond strokes of ink. It could not feel the finality in the sergeant's posture, or the way the property manager's shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of correction. The building exhaled again. Pipes clanging faintly, air shifting down the corridor. The body cam blinked, recording seconds that would later be replayed, paused, filed. To anyone watching afterward, it would show movements, hear words, record times, but it would never carry the silence that filled the space between knock and answer, or the authority that lived in recognition, not rehearsal. The machine saw. The machine stored, but it did not understand. The sergeant's eyes lingered on the clipboard only long enough to confirm what it lacked. No seal, no judge's ink, no court's weight pressed into the fibers. He let the silence hold, then reached into the inside pocket of his vest. His fingers found a small laminated card. Edges rounded from years of folding and unfolding. Creases forming faint white lines across the plastic. He pulled it free and held it steady in his palm. The card bore the city seal, embossed faintly, the color dulled from sweat and friction. Across the top, in block letters, it read tenants' rights civil protections. Beneath, sections listed in short, plain language. No lockout without court order. No removal without judicial warrant. Tenant has right to re-entry. It was not long, only a trifold pamphlet compressed into a pocket card, but it carried the authority of ordinance, written and adopted by council, upheld by courts. The property manager blinked at it, the way one blinks when something too familiar to deny has been placed in view. His pen stilled against his clipboard. His breath caught. His posture faltered. He mumbled again about procedure and notice served, but the words thinned in the space between them. The sergeant did not argue. He only held the card higher, its seal catching the fluorescent light. Proof written, not by rehearsal, but by statute. The veteran, behind the door, heard the shift. He did not need to see the card to know its weight. He had carried similar proof once, orders folded in breast pockets. Identification creased from use. Papers that spoke louder than any shouted demand. He reached for his own wallet on the table, the leather worn smooth, edges softened. From it, he drew a folded paper that lived there always. His DD2, 214 copy. Creased and refolded until the ink had grown thin. He unfolded it with deliberate care, smoothing it flat against the table beside the photograph. Doctrine met doctrine, each in its place. The hallway thickened with attention. Neighbors behind peepholes leaned closer. Curtains across the street widened by another inch. The card in the sergeant's hand was not for show, not for them. Yet its presence traveled the building, whispered through silence. The camera overhead blinked its red diode, recording the rectangle of laminate. unable to measure its authority. The sergeant tucked the card back into his vest, its corner slipping into the pocket with the ease of repetition. He pulled a pen from his chest pouch, steadier than the one clutched by the property manager, and wrote into his logbook. Civil ordinance confirmed. Lockout attempt lacks warrant. Tenant rights card referenced. The letters were sharp, unhurried, each stroke designed to survive scrutiny. The property manager shifted, tried to speak, but his voice came out lower now, thinned of its earlier authority. We followed notice requirements, he said, but it carried less force, as if even he knew the card in the sergeant's pocket outweighed his forms. Inside, the veteran folded his paper again, pressing the crease along its familiar line. He slid it back into his wallet, the leather warming under his hand. He left the photograph on the table, its taped edges catching faint light, its presence heavier than any statute. Memory carried its own doctrine, silent but binding. The sergeant straightened, closing his logbook, his words final, for now. Until a court order is presented, he said, this door remains closed. Any attempt otherwise is unlawful, documenting further as needed. His tone carried no threat, only recognition, the kind of acknowledgement that silenced argument more effectively than volume ever could. The building exhaled once more. Pipes groaned. Fluorescence buzzed. Neighbors shifted behind wood and glass. The notice still clung to the door, its tape stretched, its authority thinned. In the sergeant's pocket, the ordnance card rested steady. In the veteran's wallet, the discharge papers folded back into place. Doctrine lived in both, ready, heavier than rehearsal, firmer than bluff. And between them, silence held not claimed. The word was spoken softly, but it carried weight. Stand by, not as hesitation, not as retreat, but as a formation, a pause with discipline behind it. The sergeant said it once, his voice level, and the officers spread themselves along the hallway, as if the syllables alone had set them in motion. One officer stood near the stairwell, his shoulders squared, boots planted evenly, eyes steady on the corridor. Another posted by the elevator, leaning lightly against the wall, but never letting his attention drift. The third remained by the veteran's door, hands resting calmly at his belt, posture signaling presence rather than threat. None drew weapons, none raised voices. Their stance was quiet but firm, a perimeter written in human form. The property manager shifted his clipboard from arm to arm, his pen tapping faintly against the carbon paper. He had imagined this moment differently, compliance secured, silence broken, the hallway his stage. Instead, he now found himself surrounded by uniforms that did not echo his urgency. The word standby had recast his role from commander to bystander. His carbon forms felt lighter, his pen clumsy. He tried to clear his throat, but the sound caught in the air, muffled against the steady rhythm of officers holding their ground. Behind the door, the veteran sat again at his table. He heard the word through wood and distance, the timbre unmistakable. Stand by. He had lived it before, in other contexts, on radios clipped to vests, in tents lit by lanterns, on nights when orders shifted without warning. Stand by meant hold your position, conserve your breath, wait for recognition. It meant you were not forgotten, not abandoned, but not yet called to move. It was a word that steadied rather than unsettled. He placed his hand once more on the wallet resting on the table, the leather warm under his palm. Inside, folded paper and photograph pressed against one another like layers of doctrine and memory. He closed his eyes, let the silence of the apartment fill him, and exhaled slow. Standby was not weakness, it was preparation. The hallway changed with the word. Neighbors, still crouched behind peepholes, sensed the shift. Curiosity sharpened into focus. A woman 2 doors down whispered to a child, "They're not moving him," though her voice carried only as far as the wood. Across the street, curtains widened, faces pressed closer. The word standby interpreted through posture rather than sound. The block itself seemed to lean forward, waiting. The hallway camera blinked its red diode, storing frames of officers in formation. It did not know the meaning of the word. It captured men standing still, hands on belts, radios clipped to shoulders. It recorded the property manager's restless shuffle, the clipboard tapping once more against his chest. It filed the scene as movement and pause, missing entirely the authority that had settled the air. The sergeant checked his logbook again, his pen scratching in steady strokes. Civil standby initiated, he wrote, each word deliberate. The phrase became ink, became record, became permanence. When read later, it would appear as neutral procedure. But here, in the moment, it was a command that steadied the block, froze escalation, and carried the weight of recognition. The property manager tried again, "He's had his time," he muttered, tapping the clipboard edge against his thigh. The notice was proper. "He's in violation." His words were quieter now, less for officers than for himself. No one answered. The silence was heavier than his claim. Inside, the veteran remained still. He had lived mornings where silence saved lives, where waiting was the only command. He felt the building exhale again, pipes groaning, air shifting, light humming. The cadence of sirens had passed, replaced now by the cadence of presence. "Stand by," he whispered the word under his breath, letting it settle into him like an order received and understood. The street had learned the word too. Curtains stayed open. Eyes stayed fixed. Silence held. The block was no longer pretending at ordinary hours. It was holding position, waiting, watching. Stand by. Not absence. Not delay. A word written into posture, carried into silence. Heavier than any notice taped to a door. The property manager's clipboard had always been his badge. In hearings at city offices, in rental disputes, where words clashed harder than evidence, it gave him a sense of permanence. Its carbon forms, layered 3 deep, left imprints that could not be erased without tearing. He had imagined that on this morning, those sheets would dictate the rhythm, his pen scratching, his voice confirming. The veteran's silence reduced to compliance. But in the hallway, the clipboard no longer led. It hung awkwardly against his chest. Its weight shifted from authority to burden. The forms trembled slightly with every adjustment of his grip, their edges curling as if reluctant to be read aloud. Each tap of his pen against the board sounded less like a verdict and more like nervous habit. The officers did not turn to him. They held their ground under the single word "stand by," a posture that made the clipboard's presence seem unnecessary. No one asked to see the documents. No one nodded at the forms as if they carried weight. They watched the hallway, not the paper. Neighbors, pressed against peepholes, saw the difference. To them, it looked like a play where the lead actor had been moved to the background without warning. The uniforms had become the stage's center, their silence heavier than anything a pen could write. The clipboard, once a loud prop, seemed suddenly too small for the scene. The property manager tried to reclaim ground. He raised his voice slightly, addressing the sergeant nearest him. "The order's valid. Served 3 days ago. Non-payment, 30 days past due. This is clear, clean." His words carried the cadence of someone quoting law. But the sergeant only nodded once, and wrote another line in his logbook. "Acknowledged, documentation noted. Not enforced. Not executed. Noted. The difference was quiet, but crushing. To the property manager, the word suggested that paper had been absorbed, but not obeyed. He tapped his pen again, harder this time, as though sound alone could reclaim control. Inside the apartment, the veteran heard the raised voice, but not the words. He heard the rhythm, instead the sharper tap of pen against board, the nervous shift of shoes against tile. He did not rise. He sat still, one hand resting on the table, the other brushing against the pocket, where the wallet pressed against his side. The clipboard outside was loud in its desperation. He knew that sound. He had heard it before in voices that confused noise for strength. The camera above the stairwell recorded frames of the manager lifting his clipboard higher, gesturing with it like a shield. The lens did not understand humiliation, only posture. It captured the board tilting, the papers fluttering faintly, the officer's silence in reply. To future viewers, the footage would show a man holding documents in the face of still uniforms. To those present, it showed authority shrinking by inches. The block absorbed the change as well. Curtains across the street widened further, eyes squinting to read the language of bodies. They saw officers unshaken, the veteran's door unmoved, the property manager's pen striking harder against paper that bent but did not answer. They did not know the law's fine print, but they knew when sound lost to silence. The sergeant closed his logbook with one deliberate press of the cover. The click of the elastic strap sounded final, louder than the pen's taps. He tucked the book under his arm and spoke in a voice that carried without force. "Clipboard acknowledged." Action paused. The property manager's shoulders slumped, only slightly, but enough for every witness to see. The clipboard no longer looked like command. It looked like paper taped to a door, visible, insistent, but powerless against presence. The hallway stilled again. Officers in formation, door closed, veteran waiting, neighbors watching. The clipboard, heavy with carbon forms, hung silent. Authority had shifted, written not in pen but in posture, in pause, in the word "stand by" that made paper seem thinner than air. The street outside the veterans' building had always belonged to motion. Delivery vans double-parked, children cut chalk lines into pavement. Shopkeepers propped doors with crates that smelled of fruit or detergent. Noise stacked itself in layers. Horns clipped short. Radios bleeding into each other. The hiss of buses halting where curbs crumbled. But that morning, the rhythm bent. The first squad cars had already changed the tone. The next arrivals rewrote it entirely. Engines idled low, a heavy purr that swallowed smaller sounds. Lights flashed across brick in slow rotation. Red then blue, red then blue. Painting storefront windows until blinds looked like bars. Patrol cars lined the curb from corner to corner. Doors closed. Radios murmuring fragments, too coded for passers-by to interpret. Pedestrians slowed first out of curiosity, then out of caution. The block, so used to ignoring itself, found it had no choice but to watch. Shopkeepers leaned against thresholds, wiping their hands on aprons without realizing it. A delivery driver shut off his ignition mid-load. Boxes still stacked inside. The barber across the street stepped out with clippers in one hand, cord trailing behind him until a customer called after it. Even the usual arguments about prices, about parking, about nothing faded into a hush. The patrol cars filled not only the curb, but the air dot. At the heart of it, the building door stayed shut, its paint peeled, its frame dented from years of careless carts, but it became the center of attention all the same. The eviction notice still hung crooked on its tape. Paper curled as though uncomfortable under the weight of so many eyes. Above it, the stairwell camera blinked red, watching both hallway and street, recording a moment the neighborhood had never rehearsed. The property manager stepped out, clipboard in hand, expecting backup. Instead, the sight of a dozen cruisers unsettled him. Their presence made his papers look flimsy, their typed certainty dwarfed by steel and sirens. He lifted the board anyway, holding it high as if to remind everyone of the script. The officers outside did not move toward him. They did not take the forms or nod in agreement. They stood, arms crossed, or hands resting near belts, eyes scanning the block rather than the paper. Children who had been playing at the corner were pulled back by parents, their voices lowered as though a parade of silence demanded respect. One boy asked why so many cars had come. No one answered him. No one wanted to guess aloud. Inside the apartment, the veteran sat by the table, posture straight, though his back ached. The wallet pressed steady against his ribs. He did not open it, did not need to. The sound from outside was enough. Engines, radios, a crowd learning restraint. He had lived through mornings when noise preceded disaster. This was different. This was the kind of silence that gathered rather than threatened. A neighbor on the third floor cracked her door. Grocery bag clutched to her chest. She watched the officers line the sidewalk in quiet intervals, their presence more like a wall than a crowd. The bag of apples slipped from her grip. One rolled down the stair, thumping softly until it rested against the veteran's door. She did not retrieve it. She closed the door slowly, almost reverently. The block adjusted itself to the patrol car. Traffic bent away, drivers steering around the line of hoods and lights. Conversations stalled, then shifted into whispers. For once, no music spilled from the corner store. The rhythm was not absence, but attention. The street was listening, even if it did not yet understand what it was hearing. The property manager tapped his pen against the clipboard, sharp against cardboard, but the sound carried no further than his own shoes. Engines drowned it. Silence absorbed it. He lowered the board, suddenly aware of its weight. On a utility pole across the street, a small security camera from a grocery store caught the scene in grainy footage. Later, it would show rows of cars, officers unmoving, neighbors still. It would not record the feeling, the way a block accustomed to indifference had become an audience. That morning, for the first time, the street learned to listen. The phone call had lasted less than a minute, but its echo lingered longer than words. In the barracks years earlier, phones had been scarce, guarded like contraband. Calls were short, voices clipped, the background always noisy with drills or engines. Yet the veteran had spoken with a steadiness that crossed static. He had known then, as he knew now, that clarity did not need volume. That morning, inside his small apartment, the call had followed the same pattern. Numbers dialed with care, each pause deliberate, each digit confirmed before the next. The line had rung only once. A voice, familiar not because of who it was, but because of what it carried, answered without introduction. The veteran had spoken few words: name, address, a single sentence about the paper on the door. No complaint, no plea, just fact. Silence on the other end stretched only long enough to suggest recognition. Then came the reply, acknowledged. We'll see to it. He had ended the call without farewell. Habit had taught him that acknowledgments were enough. Words beyond them invited misinterpretation, or worse, pity. The phone, its plastic yellowed with age, clicked back into its cradle. The sound was small, but it carried the weight of ritual. Now, hours later, the silence in the hallway bore proof of that call. Officers stood where they had been told to stand. Radios confirmed presence, not purpose. The property manager's clipboard remained ignored, its forms reduced to background noise. None of it was dramatic, yet all of it was unmistakable. The street did not know the words that had passed, but it felt the call's authority in the shape of patrol cars lined bumper to bumper. Inside, the veteran leaned back against his chair. He touched the wallet in his pocket, where the photograph and letter rested against each other, and allowed himself one exhale deeper than the rest. The call had been enough, not to argue, not to bargain, but to remind. Memory had weight, and sometimes it answered phones. Neighbors speculated in whispers. Some thought he must have called a lawyer, others a councilman. A few muttered about old favors, debts still unpaid. No one said his name aloud, but his door became the center of the block's imagination. Every theory circled the same truth. The call mattered more than the paper taped beside it. The property manager, restless in the quiet, tried again. He approached an officer near the stairwell. "Do you understand? This is legal. This is binding. I'm authorized." The officer glanced once at the clipboard, then back to the door. His answer came flat, measured, standby order still in effect. The manager stepped back, his lips tightening around a pen cap. Authority had shifted away from him hours ago, and with each minute of waiting, it drained further. He scribbled something on his carbon forms, but even his own handwriting looked nervous against the paper. The street absorbed the moment differently. Children pressed against their parents' sides, learning without being told that rules could pause. Shopkeepers leaned further out of their doors. The weight of routine temporarily lifted. Even the pigeons on the telephone wire above seemed to perch quieter, as though sound itself risked breaking whatever balance held the block. The veteran closed his eyes briefly. In memory, he could still hear the faint static of radios from training grounds. The clipped replies, the weight carried in single words. That morning's call had been no different. It had not summoned rescue or demanded justice. It had simply reminded the world that memory still held a place on the line. Outside, a patrol sergeant checked his watch, wrote a line in his log, and closed the book with care. The silence thickened again, not hostile but patient. The block did not know what was coming next, but it knew one thing clearly. The call had been made, and the silence that followed was not emptiness. It was acknowledgement. In the company office, the green-bound logbook never looked like much, its cover bent at the corners, its spine carrying the oil of years of hands. Yet it was where days were reduced to lines, initials pressed deep enough to bleed into the page beneath. Weather, incidents, shifts recorded without decoration, meant to be as forgettable as they were permanent. That morning, the patrol sergeant bent over it, with the same posture he had carried in other places, where ink mattered more than voice. He wrote slowly, as though the act itself needed to be measured. 900 hours notice, attempted action paused. The words carried no heat, no hint of argument. To anyone reading later, the entry would sound procedural, but to those in the hallway, it captured a silence heavier than any command, shouted across asphalt. He underlined, paused, once, deliberately. The underline was not regulation, not required, but he left it anyway. His pen hovered over the margin, then pressed again. In smaller script, almost hesitant but clear, he added, discretion advised, record held by memory. The phrase sat lower than the main line, nearly hidden against the binding. It did not erase the notice. It did not deny the clipboard, but it amended them, shifting their weight. The property manager never saw the margin note. To him, the clipboard remained the only record that mattered. He flipped pages, made carbon copies, filled blanks with words meant to prove authority. His hand shook slightly, though he pressed harder to disguise it. Each stroke dented the paper more than it colored it, as though he hoped depth could substitute for strength. The officers did not watch his pen. They stood in their line, reading the silence instead. They knew the difference between loud paper and quiet authority. The logbook at the desk, with its underlined word and its margin note, carried more weight than the clipboard that rattled under restless hands. Outside, the block felt the imbalance too. Shopkeepers adjusted signs they had already straightened an hour before. Delivery drivers lingered longer at curbs. Neighbors held their curtains open with fingers that ached. None of them saw the ink pressed into green paper inside the office, but they recognized its echo. They saw officers unmoved by the clipboard's gestures, heard radios murmur words no civilian could decode, and understood that something heavier than eviction paper had entered the record dot in his apartment. The veteran sat still, back straight against the chair. He did not know about the margin note, but he did not need to. He trusted the pause, the silence, the way footsteps in the hall carried patience rather than force. He reached into his pocket once, touched the wallet, felt the envelope inside, and let his hand rest there. The photo, the letter, the proof unspoken, unseen remained, ready. He did not need to show it again. Memory, like paper, already held its place. The stairwell camera blinked red, capturing frames of still bodies, tilted clipboards, and the unmoving door. Its footage would later show only that. A hallway paused. It would not capture the margin note that tipped the balance. It would not record the difference between carbon paper and blue ink pressed into a green-bound log. The sergeant capped his pen, closed the book, and placed it at the desk's exact center. The sound of the cover snapping shut was soft, almost lost under the hum of fluorescence. But those nearest heard it. The weight of authority had shifted. Not erased, not shouted, not forced, just amended. When he returned to the hallway, the clipboard still hovered in the manager's hands, but the silence, steadied by a line in a logbook few would ever read, had already decided which record would endure. Evening leaned over the block with a kind of patience mornings never managed. The sun slid low, its light caught in windows that had been watching all day. Patrol cars still lined the curb, engines idling in intervals, their lights no longer frantic but steady, pulsing red and blue against brick until it seemed the buildings themselves were breathing. The paper taped to the veteran's door had curled further, corners lifting as if embarrassed to be seen. The property manager no longer tapped his pen. The clipboard hung slack at his side, its carbon forms bent, the words on them harder to believe with each hour. His voice, which had begun sharp and confident, had dulled to mutters few bothered to answer. Officers remained at ease, not in defiance but in patience, as though time itself had been placed on standby. Neighbors had settled into a rhythm of witness. Chairs scraped onto stoops. Children held tighter against laps. Grocery bags forgotten beside doors. Conversations barely rose above whispers, yet eyes stayed fixed on the scene. The block that had once hurried past itself now lingered, bound not by spectacle but by silence. Inside, the veteran sat where he had since morning, posture even, breath steady. The wallet pressed against his chest carried the photograph and the letter, unchanged yet heavier for being remembered. He did not rise, did not open the door. He trusted what waited beyond it, the kind of silence that had carried him through barracks, drills, and nights when words would have broken more than they fixed. The stairwell camera blinked red, storing the stillness in frames that would later look ordinary. A hallway, a clipboard, officers steady, but the footage would miss what everyone present felt, that the paper on the door had been emptied of force, that the pause had lasted long enough to become permanent. The sergeant checked his log once more, flipping back to the line underlined earlier. Action paused. The margin note discretion, advised record held by memory sat beneath it, quiet but indelible. He closed the book again, his pen capped, the page waiting for review only if someone cared enough to look. The silence of the block suggested no one would need to. The record already lived elsewhere, in breath, in posture, in the way neighbors now measured each glance. At last, as the sun dipped fully behind the row of roofs, an order came across radios. Stand down. The words were simple, almost casual, but their effect rippled across the block. One by one, engines turned over. Patrol cars peeled from the curb, their lights dimming as they disappeared into the distance. The officers left no trace except the impression of stillness they had held for hours. When the last car was gone, the block exhaled. Curtains fell shut. Children were set down to play again. Shopkeepers returned to counters, delivery drivers to their routes, yet none moved quickly. The rhythm had been changed. Even the pigeons above the telephone wire fluttered, as if hesitant to resume their chatter. The property manager remained alone in the hallway. The clipboard sagged from his hand, its papers crumpled at the edges. He looked once more at the notice, its tape yellowing against paint, then turned without removing it. His footsteps down the stairwell echoed hollow. Authority leaving with nothing signed, nothing enforced. In the veteran's apartment, silence remained. He touched the wallet once more, then set it on the table beside him. The photograph and letter did not need to be unfolded again. They had already spoken through presence, through pause, through the weight of memory. Outside, the block would carry the story in fragments, told and retold, but always circling the same truth. Eviction had been attempted, and silence had rewritten it. No logbook would ever call it victory. No clipboard would admit defeat. But the street itself had felt it the moment. Authority bent under memory, the hour when paper gave way to silence.